There's a fruit quietly growing in monastery gardens, mountain valleys, and forgotten backyards that contains more than 30 essential vitamins and minerals. It has one of the highest antioxidant scores ever recorded, higher than blueberries, higher than pomegranates. Ancient cultures believed it preserved youth, sharpened vision, and extended life well beyond what was considered normal. Modern science later confirmed it contains compounds linked to cellular protection, immune resilience, and metabolic health. And yet, you've probably never seen it fresh in a grocery store. You've never been encouraged to grow it. And most people only know it as an expensive supplement or dried superfood. So the question isn't whether this fruit exists. The question is, why don't you know it can grow almost anywhere? Before we go further, if you care about forgotten plants, buried knowledge, and natural systems that quietly outperform modern products, subscribe now to Buried Nature Archive. This channel exists to uncover what was deliberately ignored, erased, or rebranded. Now let's talk about what happened. Because this fruit didn't disappear by accident. The story you're about to hear isn't about extinction, it's about omission. This plant didn't fail. It didn't stop working. It didn't vanish from the earth. It was simply never taught. The real mystery isn't whether it does what ancient cultures claimed. The mystery is why modern systems had no incentive for you to know it exists. Because a fruit that grows for decades, regenerates itself, and doesn't require constant purchases creates a problem for certain industries. And that's where this story begins. For more than 2,000 years, this fruit appeared in traditional medical texts across Asia. It was grown in monastery gardens, remote valleys, and family courtyards, not as a luxury, not as a supplement, but as a daily food. Monks ate it regularly. Herbalists prescribed it for long-term vitality. Farmers consumed it seasonally, fresh when possible, dried when necessary. It wasn't used as a quick cure. It was used slowly, consistently, over a lifetime. Traditional texts didn't call it medicine in the modern sense. They called it a superior food, something taken not to treat illness, but to preserve function, vision, strength, energy, longevity. And across multiple regions, something unusual kept appearing. People stayed active far longer than expected. In high mountain valleys, farmers worked fields well into their 80s and 90s. In isolated regions known for long lifespans, daily consumption of this fruit was common across generations. There were even legendary figures, herbalists and villagers, whose lifespans were recorded as exceeding 2 centuries. Western scientists dismissed these claims as exaggeration, folklore, or poor record-keeping. And that skepticism is fair. But here's what's harder to dismiss. The pattern repeated itself. Different regions, different cultures, same fruit, same daily use, same unusually resilient aging. Not miracles, patterns. And the plant itself was never mythical. It's a hardy perennial shrub. Once planted, it produces fruit for decades, often 50 years or more. It tolerates drought. It survives extreme cold and heat. It thrives in poor soil where other crops fail. It doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need pesticides. It propagates easily from cuttings. In other words, it's the opposite of a fragile superfood. And that's where modern science enters the story. In the late 20th century, advances in nutritional analysis made it possible to test foods with far greater precision. When researchers finally analyzed this fruit, the results were unexpected. Antioxidant capacity far beyond commonly praised berries, a rare profile of amino acids, unusual for a fruit, unique polysaccharides not found in other foods, high concentrations of carotenoids linked to eye health. Peer-reviewed studies began documenting immune support, metabolic benefits, and cellular protective effects. The data was real. The fruit was legitimate. And yet, nothing changed. You still couldn't buy it fresh. You still couldn't find the plant in garden centers. It still wasn't treated like food. So why? The first explanation was logistics. Fresh berries are delicate. Their shelf life is short, only a few days under refrigeration. They bruise easily. They don't survive long-distance shipping. Supermarkets required durability, uniformity, predictable transport timelines. This fruit didn't fit the system. But that only explains part of the story, because there was another path available: processing. Once the fruit was dried, powdered, juiced, or extracted, everything changed. Shelf life extended from days to years. Shipping became easy. Markup became enormous. And suddenly, the fruit wasn't food anymore. It became a product. Supplement companies moved quickly. Exotic branding appeared overnight. Claims of vitality, longevity, and rejuvenation flooded marketing materials. Prices skyrocketed. A fruit that could be grown at home for decades became a $40 bottle. And when regulators stepped in to restrict disease claims, the language simply changed. Treats became supports. Cures became promotes. The product stayed. The profits stayed. What disappeared wasn't the fruit. It was the idea that you could grow it yourself. Walk into almost any major garden center today. You'll see annual flowers that must be replaced every season, perennials that require constant inputs, fruit plants that depend on fertilizers, sprays, and ongoing purchases. What you won't see is a shrub that produces for 50 years with minimal care. Because plants you buy once don't generate repeat business. They don't sell fertilizer. They don't sell pesticides. They keep customers dependent. So they don't get shelf space. There were attempts to change this. Universities and private breeders tried to patent new varieties. Slightly larger fruit. Fewer thorns. Compact growth. But the original plant had been cultivated for thousands of years. It belonged to the public domain. Anyone could propagate it. Once awareness failed to grow, the patents quietly faded. Meanwhile, supplements filled the gap. Dried berries. Extract pills. Juice concentrates. All derived from the same plant people elsewhere grew in their yards. And that's the part almost no one talks about. The knowledge never disappeared. Chinese immigrant communities never stopped growing it. Families passed cuttings from generation to generation. Backyard gardens quietly produced fresh fruit every summer. No branding, no mystique, no markup. Just a plant doing what it had always done. Growing it isn't complicated. It thrives across most temperate climates. It tolerates heat and cold. Once established, it requires little water. A single cutting can root in weeks. Harvests begin within a few years. Production continues for decades. This isn't an exotic miracle. It's accessible. And that's exactly why it was never promoted. Because this story isn't really about one fruit. It's about systems. Systems that profit from extraction rather than regeneration. From dependency rather than independence. From selling solutions instead of preserving sources. When something works too well and doesn't need to be replaced, it becomes invisible. So let's return to the opening question. Why don't you know about the fruit that ancient cultures believed preserved youth? Because it was never banned. It was never outlawed. It was simply reframed, repackaged, processed, sold back to you without the plant. The fruit didn't disappear. The knowledge did. And knowledge can always return. If this changed the way you see food, health, or the stories behind what you're sold, subscribe to Buried Nature Archive. We're uncovering the plants, systems, and truths that never stopped working, only stopped being taught. Because the soil is still alive. The plants are still growing. And the knowledge was never gone. It was just buried.